I'm Clifford, and I'm going to talk to you today about the Fed. Again, this is actually part two because there's too much to be said about it. Yesterday I showed how it's completely unconstitutional. There's nothing in the Commerce Clause that permits it. And in fact, I'm going to let you see some additional language. I'm going to tell you more reasons why it's unconstitutional today. First of all, the Interstate Commerce Clause gives the federal government what Madison called a supervisory power over the states. It doesn't permit the federal government to do things in our economy or to intrude or to control individual businesses. And that's exactly what they've been pretending it can do since 1942. There's a case called Wickard v. Filbert that essentially said that clause permits the federal government to tell any business or any person who's engaged in commerce, which can just be communicating with people, anything it wants to tell them to do. It can dictate the terms of their contracts. It can tell them how to use their land. This is how far the court went astray and how authoritarian the government got under progressives and how much the court just rubber stamped it. That's what Wickard v. Filbert is. And prior to that, they had at least admitted that it involved commerce among the states. So it had to be cross-border. It had to involve more than one state. It had to be multi-state type of thing. And in Wickard v. Filbert, they said, nah, it doesn't matter if it just involves one state. They can just, if Congress in its discretion decides that it's for the general welfare of the people. They misused the General Welfare Clause, which I've also spoken about. That's a limiting clause. Madison also wrote one of the Federalist Papers about that, saying any notion that does anything but limit the explicit powers described in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which come after it, it's just nonsense. Because then it would make no sense for them to enumerate the powers. All they would have to say is, yeah, Congress could do anything it wants. We're not going to limit the powers. But that's exactly... that's what they've been saying. But that's exactly the opposite of what the Constitution says and what the whole purpose of the Constitution was. The purpose of the Constitution was to create a central government which did not exist before that. But prior to that, it was just the state governments which existed. And those state governments were going to survive. But the federal government was given certain powers, and the states surrendered certain powers. And one of those powers is the interstate commerce among the states. The federal government's allowed to regulate that. And also commerce with foreign nations and with Indians. And as I pointed out, if it can actually regulate individual businesses based on that clause, then it can regulate individual citizens of foreign nations, which is crazy. And that's not what the clause says. Anyway, that's the clause they've been using to justify the Fed. And they've been pretending, I'm going to give you some history, that at the beginning of the Republic, Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State. And Hamilton was in the banking business. He was also a lawyer. He actually had multiple professions. A brilliant guy. Anyway, he came up with this idea that having a bank which the U.S. government would have ready access to, that was what was important. They didn't want to have to go shopping for a bank to put money in accounts. And he wanted the government to be able to have access to it. He didn't want it to own it. The idea was, it became the first bank in the United States. And the idea was that the federal government, first of all, would issue its charter. Normally, corporate charters have to be issued by states. But in this case, the federal government would issue the charter. Big deal. And although there's nothing in the Constitution that permits it, as Jefferson pointed out. Anyway, the federal government would issue its charter, and it would own 20% of the stock. And the rest of the stock was owned by private individuals. It did not have, unlike the Fed today, any regulatory power over other banks at all. It was supposed to be maybe the first among equals, in the sense that it had the prestige of having 20% of it owned by the federal government. That was the only attribute of government that it actually had. But other than that, it did the same thing other banks did. At that time, all the currency in the country was created by banks. There was no federal bank issuing currency. That's what the Fed does, by the way. It issues currency and it prevents anyone else from doing it. It completely monopolizes the currency and it completely controls all the banks in the country. It basically dictates interest rates of various kinds. They're allowed to charge customers different amounts, but it dictates minimal interest rates for all kinds of things. It had massive effect. And what the biggest impact it has on the banking industry is it literally controls it. It can cut off, it can tell banks when they can have to stop issuing credit to people. So it can cut off the money supply, and that's what they've done on occasion, mainly under Democrat presidents. For example, the Fed, we found this out, well, we knew about it at the time, under the Obama administration. They were putting pressure on the Fed to cut off all lending or all banking ability at all to various businesses, perfectly legal businesses that the Obama administration had contempt for, like gun manufacturers. They didn't want them to be able to use the banking business. And more recently, they tried to do it to the oil and gas business. The Fed issued regulations under Joe Biden, which would have had the effect of doing that. They were going to, and it would have had a massive effect in terms of costs for businesses and banks. They were going to require all sorts of reporting, all related to the hoax about global warming. It was just absolutely insane. It had nothing to do with anything the Fed is authorized to do. But that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to cut off all credits to all oil and gas companies. And because the Fed is given this power of control over the banking business and over who the banking business does business with. Banking business has to report everything they do to the federal government, and including the Fed. And the Fed, and there's multiple other agencies that also control the banking business. It is the most highly regulated business. And of course, it's the one that's had the biggest problems. Every time we've had a recession, it's because there's been some kind of a financial collapse. Like in 2008, there were multiple reasons how that the federal government created that. First, it forced banks to lend to people who couldn't afford to buy the homes, based on these crazy ideas they came up with in the Clinton administration, actually. It took a while for it to bankrupt the banking business. But in 2008, that's what happened. It was a huge crash, and the Bush administration completely mismanaged it. Anyway, early on in the Republic, Alexander Hamilton wanted there to be a bank that the federal government could go to regularly. That's really what he had in mind. And it wasn't going to have any power over the other banks, or that was the idea. And it was only supposed to be 20% owned by the federal government. The other 80% was private individuals. And it would just do what the other banks did. It would issue money backed by gold, just like all the other banks. It didn't have any monopoly at all. In those days, that's where the currency came from. It was not a nationalized currency. It was a national currency in terms of value. The federal government wanted to make sure the value was maintained. And that's why it very importantly specified that among the very few crimes the federal government's allowed to prosecute, piracy on the high seas is one, and counterfeiting. That was the thing they were most worried about. That's why in Article 1, Section 10, they say they don't even want the states to try to get around that by permitting people to pay things in anything other than gold or silver. And in the Constitution, as I said in the first discussion of the Fed, the only power the federal government is given about money is to coin it. It's not allowed to print it. Basically, the federal government is committing the crime of counterfeiting every time it prints paper money. And no one was allowed to, it would have been a crime for anyone to print paper money that wasn't backed by gold. That was what was required at that time. That would have been considered counterfeiting, making any currency and being something other than a bank. You had to be a real bank. Anyway, Hamilton wanted that bank to be created. And he had his own bank also. It was basically creating a competitor to his own bank. It wasn't like he had a personal interest in this. He thought this would be of value for the government to be able to manage its money that way. And Washington was very concerned about whether this was constitutional. Today, you think they'd care? Not even close. He had Hamilton and Jefferson write memoranda to him about this. And you can read these on the internet. And Jefferson, who knew something about the Constitution, as you know, he was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, which is part of our Constitution. It's one of our founding documents. And the Supreme Court has recognized in the case of Algier v. State of Louisiana that the Declaration of Independence is itself incorporated by reference into the Constitution, and all of the rights that they were fighting the revolution for, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is the right to run your business. That's what that meant. The right to engage in the trade or business that you wanted. All of that is part of the Constitution. And Jefferson was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. He also was involved in the creation. He wasn't here while the Constitution was being written, although Madison was here. Madison was the principal author, and Jefferson communicated with Madison extensively about it while he was in France at the time. He was our ambassador to France. Anyway, by the time the Constitution was ratified, Jefferson was back, and he wanted those, what we now have, it's now known as the Bill of Rights. It's the first 10 amendments. It's things like freedom of speech. Under the original Constitution, it wasn't that we didn't have all of those rights. The fact that they weren't included, we had them implicitly, but Jefferson wanted them to be explicit because he didn't want there to be any doubt in writing that these things were part of our Constitution. And that's really a major reason why we have the Bill of Rights. It was Thomas Jefferson. He was a major figure in the founding of this country. And some of the amendments were particularly important to him. The 9th and 10th Amendments, which the Supreme Court has been pretending aren't even there. They've never once relied on them in a case. Never once. And what those amendments say is any power that is not specifically delegated, and that's a term that it uses, delegated. All the powers that the federal government has are delegated. It says any power not delegated in the Constitution itself to the federal government is retained by the citizens or the states. There are no implicit powers in the federal government. None. It doesn't have anything like that. Anyway, Hamilton wanted this. Jefferson wrote this in a very strong opinion saying, no, the whole thing is unconstitutional. Forget about the Interstate Commerce Clause supporting this. Hamilton did not rely on the Interstate Commerce Clause, which is the clause the court relies on now, and basically to permit anything. Hamilton relied on what's called the Necessary and Proper Clause. He said, well, if you look at all of these other clauses, like raising an army, there are things, the federal government has to handle money. So under that, it becomes necessary and proper in order for it to actually do things like pay the troops, collect money, that it becomes necessary and proper for it to be able to have this 20% interest in a bank. Now, what the courts have been pretending, when the Fed, and until the Fed was founded in 1913, and this happened under Wilson. 1913 was one of the most abominable years in the entire history of this republic. First of all, Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901 when McKinley was shot. He didn't start in with his progressive, which means Marxist. It's a euphemism for Marxist that all American Marxists have always used, because they knew that calling themselves Marxist, bad PR. So they call themselves progressive. Doesn't that sound nice? They're progressive. They don't want to go back to something terrible. That's what the word is supposed to imply. What it really implies is a totalitarian government, a government that has complete control. And Wilson made this explicit in his writings. He was a government professor before, and then he became president of Princeton. He wrote extensively on what the government should be, in his view. And he admitted it was totally unconstitutional. What he wanted was a government where the people basically had to listen to experts. And experts would tell us everything what to do, and we would have these bureaucracies filled with experts who were independent of anything. They weren't elected by the people, and they could tell the people what to do about anything. But he admitted it was unconstitutional, and it clearly is. As a republic, which we are guaranteed in the Guarantee Clause, we're guaranteed a Republican form of government. What that means, and that term meant something very specific to the founders. The term means that that there's nobody with any power in the federal government who wasn't either elected by a majority of the citizens, directly or indirectly, or was appointed by someone who was, and controlled by someone who was elected. So there are no independent people, or there aren't supposed to be any independent agencies or people in the federal government. Wilson wanted to have nothing but that. Independent agencies. And that has been what the Democrat Party has been promoting ever since Wilson. They've been pretending that this makes them non-political. So that makes them good, because the people in them are saints who just do things for the good of the people. But that's the garbage they've been selling. And that's the basis on which they've been promoting things like the Fed. The Fed was the first really independent in the way it was set up. Nobody in it is elected by anybody. And they're appointed by the federal government, by the president, but they actually have terms of office. They think they own their seats. In fact, there's this woman who Trump just tried to fire. Woman shouldn't be on the Fed anyway. I mean, she knows absolutely nothing about economics. Her specialty is promoting racist DEI. That's literally her specialty, promoting racism in America and showing how great it is. I'm not kidding. And that's what DEI is. DEI is euphemism for racism. And racism is simply making opinions and decisions based on someone's race instead of on the merits of the situation. That's what DEI is, and that's what racism is. And it's been outlawed. Everywhere the Supreme Court permits can do so, or where cases have come up. There's a case against Harvard in 2022 where they said you can't do that. You can't use race in connection with the universities. Now, the universities are still fighting that. They're trying to promote racism. It's a big fight that Trump has been involved in. Anyway, with the Fed, Hamilton said this thing was barely permissible under the necessary and proper clause. Jefferson said no. So what it is, having that bank with 20%, totally different from the Fed, which is owned completely by the federal government and controlled by it, but not by anybody in it. So you have this bureaucracy where nobody answers to anybody. And in theory, when you hear the news, they'll tell you, oh, the president can't fire the president, the chief of the Fed. No, he can't fire him. He's got his term. He owns it. That's how ridiculous it is. In our government, there's three branches, the judicial, executive, and legislative. And if the Fed isn't part of the executive branch, then it's not allowed in our government because the federal government is created in the Constitution. That document is a contract between the cities and the citizens and the states. That's why it says we the people. And that's what it is. It's a contract. And there were pre-existing laws of contract under the common law. And that's why it has no enforcement mechanism in it. There's nothing in it that says how it's supposed to be enforced. But that's because the common law preceded it, and contracts are supposed to be enforced under the common law. And the Fed is simply a Frankenstein monster. And anyway, they've been pretending that because the Supreme Court later, in a case called McCulloch v. Maryland, said that the first bank of the United States, which I've just described, and which they went ahead with over Jefferson's objection, Washington said, all right, I'll go along with Hamilton, who says the necessary and proper clause, combined with all these other clauses, not the Commerce Clause, that permits it. And what I'll show you is what Madison had to say about another thing. Madison was president later. He vetoed spending of money on things like bridges and canals. Take a look at the language. You can see it right now. It's right next to me. It's language taken from his veto message when he vetoed legislation to spend money on roads and canals. He said it was totally unconstitutional and that the Commerce Clause did not permit it. So the Commerce Clause has been expanded way beyond its meaning. You could also read what Chief Justice Marshall, who wrote McCulloch v. Maryland, which did say that the first bank of the United States is constitutional. And it basically followed Hamilton's opinion. It's basically the same. But in terms of, that wasn't the only issue involved in that case. It's a complicated case. One of the things it said, by the way, is that the power to tax is the power to destroy. It didn't have before it the power to regulate in the modern sense. But if the power to tax is the power to destroy, the power to regulate is the power of taking power away from the citizens. That's what the power of regulation is. It's when the owners of the property or the business no longer can control it. They have to go to the government for permission to do things, to run their own company. That's what regulation means in real life. And the Fed does that to every bank in the country. It caused the Dust Bowl in 1929 when it cut off all credit to the banks which were lending to farmers. And because it was in the middle of a drought, the topsoil all got blown away. That's what the Dust Bowl was. If they could have used any irrigation, it would have transformed it. And it also caused the Great Depression. And this is not speculation. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz wrote a whole book. It's published in 1963. Nobody disputes this, even the leftist economists. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz proved that the Fed caused the Great Depression. Caused it to begin. It was the FDR measures that were supposed to help with it, the New Deal, which prolonged it. And that was admitted to by Henry Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary, in 1929. He basically admitted that the whole thing was a disaster. In fact, he did. He admitted that. He admitted all it did was it put us deeply in debt. He didn't want to say anything bad about FDR. But the truth is that depression, there wouldn't have been a Great Depression. There would have been a recession followed by a recovery without all that terrible legislation. Anyway, in 1913, Wilson was president. They created the Fed, this Frankenstein monster, which answers to no one, and which has massive control over the economy. You hear about it all the time. It affects stock prices, anything that the Fed chairman does, and anything he says. It's just incredible, the amount of power. And it's just one man. It's not supposed to be that way. The money supply is supposed to come from private banks competing with each other, and the value during the first, when the Republic was formed, until 1913, there was no inflation. Prices even went down. Since the Fed's been formed, as of 2020, the dollar was worth 1/23 of what it was worth in 1913, and there's been 20 to 40% inflation since 2020. It all depends how you measure the inflation during the Biden administration. It was massive. We saw it at the supermarket. Just things like the price of eggs, everything went up, and gasoline. Now, President Trump has brought down the price of gas about 40% since he's been in office. And that's because Biden was also trying to destroy the oil and gas business to the extent that he could, which was also helping our enemies overseas, by the way, Iran and Putin, because it kept these are countries which the entire income of the country depends on selling oil. So the more expensive oil is, the more money they have. Putin couldn't have afforded to invade Ukraine under Trump's policies. It was Biden's policies that permitted it, and permitted it to continue. Now, once he's in there, he can't just leave. So he's got his own problems. But in terms of the Fed, those memos were written, and Chief Justice Marshall did say that the Fed could continue. Not the Fed, the first bank in the United States. That's the history behind it. But there's even more. The reason that they're not allowed to do anything, and the reason why that phrase, to coin money, is in the Constitution I mentioned previously, it was because in the early 18th century, that same century, during the regency of Louis XV, there was a regent, and they called the Banque Générale of France. It was a national bank. France hadn't had one before. Now, the Bourbons, who were the monarchy, or the family that were the monarchs, they lived high, and they engaged in wars. They were always broke. And so they wanted to come up with some way to have free money. And that's what central banks do. It's just too much for them to resist printing the money. And that's what the Fed's been doing. And over time, any restraints on what it did have just gone away. It's called fiat currency. The only reason it has any value at all is because it happens to have a monopoly of legality of currency in the United States. And our economy is the greatest economy. But that's what it depends on for its value. The fact that only the federal government's allowed to print it, that it limits the amount that can be printed, and that's the only legal currency here. But there is no gold backing it, nothing. At least with the Banque Générale, before it went belly up, it was backed essentially by the land, which is the Louisiana territory that Jefferson bought later from Napoleon. But at that time, it was French, and it was a huge amount of land. And I mean, it's about a third of the United States now. And that was the underlying specie for the money that was generated by the Banque Générale in France. And they just couldn't resist printing more and more money. And that's why it went belly up. And that's why the founders didn't want that. They didn't want anything but a very sound currency, because they wanted this country to have the soundest, the best business environment any place could have, because that would make us the richest people in the world and the freest, the most able. Because when businesses are free to operate within the common law and within the laws of the market, they produce better and better stuff for the people. And people buy and sell what they want to buy and sell without having to go asking some nanny, some bureaucrat, oh, can I buy this? And now we have what's called prior restraints. These agencies like the FDA, which was created in 1906. Basically, Roosevelt and Wilson each created the agencies that they thought were absolutely necessary to have a vice-like grip on the economy by the federal government. Roosevelt created the FDA, which had effect over the biggest industry in the country at that time, which was still farming, agriculture. And he also created the FBI's purpose is to just investigate stuff. There wasn't any federal investigative body. It's a standing army against the people of the United States, and he used it against businesses. That was what it was for. Later, they sort of got a better name for and arguably it was legal when Prohibition was ratified, because it needed some police force to enforce it. But that's the stuff that the progressives gave us. Prohibition, which finally got thrown out, even by progressives. That's how they got the name liberal, because Franklin Roosevelt said, "Oh, I'm a liberal because I'm against prohibition," even though he had been a progressive before, and they were all in favor of prohibition. That's how it got passed. And there wasn't any real opposition. It's terrible that was here. Anyway, the country was miserable during that. It made organized crime rich, and the progressives gave us that, and it gave us the income tax in 1913, that same year. And Wilson also created what's called the Federal Trade Commission, which has this massive power. There's really no limit on it. It investigates to see if businesses are doing things that the federal government thinks are okay. Primarily, it's been an antitrust enforcement body, but that's not what it's limited to. They issue orders of all kinds. And what you have to understand is, under our real Constitution, the only body that is ever allowed to issue an order to citizens, including prior restraints on citizens, are courts, and courts are only allowed to do it after due process. These agencies create these prior restraints in the form of regulations, which are now laws because they don't qualify as laws, but they function as laws. That's what these agencies do, and the Fed is one of them. The Fed is the worst one of all. The Fed has damaged our currency. It's been principally involved in causing every single financial catastrophe ever since it was formed. And it was there. The income tax was also ratified that year in the form of the 16th Amendment. The people were tricked into doing it. They were told, "Oh, we're only going to tax the rich," which is what it was like for about 10 minutes. And then they started in. And by the way, the only two provisions, there's two income tax law has been amended an infinite number of times, but there's two sets of statutes in it that have never been touched. And by the way, the whole thing, the way they got the income tax, they copied the income tax law of Kaiser Wilhelm's tyrannical Germany. That's where they got it from. And the two most tyrannical things in it, which are not permitted in the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment has nothing in it saying Congress shall pass any law it wants to enforce this. That language is in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. It's not in the 16th Amendment. It's not allowed to have any special powers to enforce it. Basically, the federal government's allowed to be a creditor of the people, and it's allowed to impose and collect as a creditor an income tax. But there are two sets of statutes that are in there that have never been changed. I think there was a comma added to one statute, but it's the employer withholding stuff and the crimes. All those crimes, and the way the criminal statutes are written is such that the slight, German compliance ideas, that's where they got it from. That's how you have to think to understand. When you read these statutes, the slightest deviation from absolutely perfect compliance goes from being a civil violation to a criminal one only if the citizen is more willful. That's the only difference. And it's a very easy threshold for the government to prove. And they can terrify people with this. And that's how they use it, by the way. They use it, they prosecute these things very selectively. And they use it to terrify people. And that's its purpose, to terrify people into always complying with the income tax. And the employer withholding stuff, what that is, in order for that normal situation, in order for a creditor to be able to have an employer withhold someone's income, they have to get a judgment against that citizen first. Then they have to go back and get another court order to enforce it with what's called a garnishment. The federal government gets that automatically. It's treated as an automatic judgment creditor and someone who got a court order to enforce that's how they collect most of the income tax. That's the beauty of 1913. And the country has suffered ever since then with all of the combination of legislation. There's bad stuff that came later also, but boy, that was really some year. And the Fed was the worst part of the whole thing, and there's nothing in the opinion in McCulloch v. Maryland that permits it, because that was a whole different bank. That was nothing like what the Fed is. I'm talking about the first bank of the United States. It was just a bank that the federal government owned 20% of, and it issued the charter. But it didn't control any banks at all. Now, it happens that in real life, it got arrogant, and it did all sorts of It was obnoxious. And it made Jackson hate banks so much that in 1831 he announced, we're not going to have any more paper money in America. You talk about causing a panic. So he wouldn't even let the banks, anyway, it was just nuts. He could be a little crazy. Anyway, I'm Cliff Ribner, and I hope you like this video, and if you do, please tell people about it, and please tell people about my website, cliffordribner.com, and read my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.